So thank you. Thank you for coming. Really excited to see all these folks here, and welcome to our That's Not Funny panel on the environment. We're going to try to bring the appropriate amount of seriousness to the subject tonight, which is to say, not much, very little as we can manage. I'm Jenny Price. I am the visiting Barron Professor of the Environment and the Humanities. This actually has a longer title, but at Princeton Environmental Institute and Lewis Center for the Arts. And as someone who has really gotten very, very tired of the bad rap that environmentalists get these days for being overly serious, or what's another way to say it, righteous, pious, humorless. Anybody want to add something?
Sanctimonious.
Sanctimonious. Anybody else?
Beautiful.
Beautiful. My students have learned nothing, apparently. Okay. So because of this, I've actually long threatened to teach a course called The Environment Can Be Funny. I went around for a long time saying, I'm going to teach a course called The Environment Can Be Funny. So first, I want to thank the Princeton Environmental Institute for actually calling my bluff here, and also just for being a really fabulous place to work, for all the support that I get here to do interesting and fun things, and for hosting this event and bringing our two of our panelists to this coast, which is obviously from the sillier coast. We had to import folks to be funny about the environment from the other coast, and I recently came from the other coast myself. So we decided, we had a very short talk actually, and we decided that to do very short introductions, because we decided that no one really listens to introductions or cares about them all that much. So, and I am in the very unusual position of being both a moderator and a panelist, which I actually think is illegal in academia. So hopefully no one will report me on this. But we're going to actually introduce each other, since we don't have an actual person who just does that. So let me introduce you to Yoram Bauman, and you can read those too. So Yoram Bauman, on the right here with his hand up, we brought him here from Seattle. He is the world's only stand-up economist. I think he's the world's first and only stand-up economist. That's right. Stand-up economist, so I assume stand-up in both senses of the word. He has performed everywhere, lots of important places with people like Paul Krugman and economist Robin Williams. He organizes a humor session every year at the American Economics Association meeting, which sounds like fun. I don't know if the meeting sounds like fun, but the session sounds like fun. And he could not do any of this without his Ph.D., of course, from the University of Washington, right? And he is, in fact, a real-life environmental economist and the author of a book called Tax Shift, which I think is serious as it should be, and the author of the cartoon Introduction to Economics in 2 volumes, because, of course, it would need 2 volumes, and the forthcoming, any minute now, cartoon Introduction to Climate Change, which we have, what I have now found out is a blad for. That's called a blad. And he is obsessed with carbon taxes. Nate, you want to add anything to Yoram's introduction?
No, he does seem to be a stand-up guy.
Okay. Oh, and he is doing a show tonight that everybody's invited to in the basement of Campus Club at 9:30 with a couple of student warm-up acts. There's food. There's Chipotle. Okay.
All right, so Nate Johnson is also on the panel. Thank you for that introduction, Jenny. Nate is, I learned that he and I both grew up without televisions, although when he went camping, he got to have a tent. He's sort of ended up in a path that led him to journalism. He writes for Grist now. He has written this fabulous book, All Natural, with a giant subtitle that even he can't remember.
Can you say it?
A skeptic's quest to...
Let Nate say it.
We don't have time for that. A skeptic's quest to discover if the natural approach to diet, childbirth, healing, and the environment really keeps us healthier and happier. And his next book that he's working on is going to be about urban environments.
So Jenny Price is an environmentalist, but there's something that fundamentally sets her apart from the rest. And I've been trying to figure out how to put this delicately. Most environmentalists are clean, and she is not. She's a dirty environmentalist, which is to say that she likes her environment to include people. You know, when you're outside, it's not the dirt that's dirty, it's the signs of humanity. And Jenny likes that stuff. She's the type of person that goes off to South America to study birds and ends up writing about plastic flamingos. And in doing this kind of thinking, she busted the barn door down and allowed a whole flock of environmental writers, me included, to wander out of the confines of the traditional ideology and kind of blink in the sunshine. And she has a PhD. I have more, but then I wanted it to be the same length as everybody else.
So the way this is going to work, I got rid of my notes, is we're going to show you a little bit of our work first. Let's see, we're going to start with Nate, and then me, and then Yoram, and then me, and then Nate. Don't ask. Long process trying to figure that out. And then, so we're going to show you a little bit of our work in those short stretches, and then we're going to talk a little bit about why we're so serious and why we think that environment isn't funny and it should, in fact, be not funny at all. And then we'll open it up to discussion. We just ask that you really be as serious as possible during the discussion. That would be appropriate. So, Nate.
So, I come to this from a very West Coast hippie perspective. That's me on day one there. And, you know, I was born at home. And what's really striking to me about this picture is not so much what's in the picture as what's not in it. You know, there's none of the plastic, the gowns, the IV towers, none of those bracelets that they give you to make sure a psychopath doesn't steal your baby in the hospital. And instead, you know, we're all just in this kind of idyllic, comfortable in our natural environment type of setting. And so this is the type of ideology that I was born into, that we're striving to find harmony with nature and get away from the evils of technology. And the interesting thing about growing up in a family that believes this is that you get a front row seat on all the ways in which it fails. And instead of being sanctimonious about these things, it really forces you to figure out how to make light of it so that it doesn't become simply depressing and sad. And so these are more pictures of that was me when I was blonde and off camping with a tent, unlike some of our more hardcore compatriots. And so a little bit older. And so what I wanted to do in the beginning of writing my book was to take a look at this idea that what was natural was healthy and good in a way that simply didn't dismiss it as critiques often do. Because this idea that what's natural is good is really tenderly wedded to my sense of childhood innocence. And I think there are a lot of ways in which it's absolutely true. But I also wanted to have a critique that was rigorous and scientific as well. So I was helped in this by the fact that I had a bit of wild nature move into my house while I was working on this project. And this is helpful because, you know, when nature is out there in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, it's very abstract and you can miss things about the realities of it. But when it's in your home, you really have to make a choice. You know, do you change your life to fit nature, or do you change nature to fit your life? And so 2.5 years ago, a wild beast moved into my house. We named her Josephine. And I think an infant really is a perfect representative of nature. You know, there's no, if there are termites that invade your house, you can gas them. If there are mice, you can set out traps. If there are wolves, you can hold them off with a shotgun, but there's no defense against a baby. And it brings out all of the most basic elemental facts of primitive life into your existence. You know, you have the howling, you have the excretion at its most savage, you have the rugged nudity. These things become front and center. And so And then in figuring out how to deal with this, of course, you have the two schools. You have the idea that because an infant is an unsocialized wild beast, you need to shape it to the norms of civilization as quickly as possible. Or there's this other school of thought that holds that an infant is unsocialized and therefore wise. It hasn't been corrupted yet by civilization and by technology. It's like a noble savage. It's tiny and incontinent, but noble. So, this trying to resolve these two oppositional theories has been the focus of my work for a while now, and I will stop there so we can keep things moving.
Thank you. That one. Yeah. This one here. Yeah. Oh, okay. No, yes, that's good. Okay, I'm going to read for my, I have a green advice column. I actually call it my not quite green advice column called Green Me Up JJ. I'm actually not going to read from that one yet. I'm going to do that one next. I'm going to read this one. Dear JJ, my 8-year-old son Rory wants to play in a baseball league, but the closest one is 2 towns away, 28 miles. My wife wants to do it, but I think it's more important that Rory knows about climate change and learns how to act responsibly. Please advise. Jason, warming up in Wallula, Washington. Dear Jason, yes, this is a tough question, and it's exactly the sort of argument that families are having more and more these days. Happily, though, I can suggest 2 easy ways you might solve it. 1, you could carpool. Or 2, you might try a simple and very useful equation that 2 math whizzes at Berkeley have developed. Here's how it works. First, you have to figure out your FWC, your family warming coefficient. To do that, you take the weight in grams of your heart, add the weight of your wife's heart times 2, and multiply by the volume in cc's of your child's dreams. Multiply by the number of things that you value half or more as much as doing your part to reduce carbon. Example, family, friendship, health, travel, chocolate. Then sit your child down and explain that the world as we know it is going to end if we don't stop doing things like driving 8-year-olds 56 miles round trip to play baseball. Add the weight of the child's guilt to the previous total. Okay, that's your FWC, which you can now use to calculate answers to the specific questions that come up in your family. In this case, how far is too far for Little League? You're almost there. Just add together the distance one way to the game, the weight of the vehicle you plan to drive, and the weight of the people and equipment times 2 inside it. Multiply this sum by the gas mileage, and divide by 2 if it's a hybrid vehicle, or multiply by 2.3 if the hybrid gets less than or equal to 6 miles per gallon more than your other or previous vehicles. Add half the air miles you've flown in the past 15 months, multiply by 1.5 for business class, 2 for first class, and subtract the number of offsets you purchased, and immediately add back the same number. Subtract the square root of the number of children that you and your wife have decided not to have primarily because of their energy demands. Now add the distance that all the grandparents will drive or fly, multiply by 3.2 if they fly, to their grandchild's games in the course of the season, and subtract the number of deceased grandparents times 3. Then you just divide by the combined total weight of moms and apple pies in your town that will compensate for the absence of baseball. Then you just multiply that number by your FWC. And that's what you get. My student Nigel actually tried to work this out. It didn't really work that well, did it? Not as well as I expected, unfortunately. Or carpool, let us know what you decide.
Thanks. My name is Yoram Bauman. I appear before you this afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, as the world's first and only stand-up economist. Thanks. It's a niche market. I really only have one thing going for me as a stand-up economist, and that's low expectations. Actually, that's not true. I have one other thing going for me as a stand-up economist. I get to make fun of macroeconomists. You know I'm a real economist because I can poke fun at subdisciplines that are totally indistinguishable to people on the outside. You know, like people in Washington State, where I live, make fun of people in Oregon, and people in Alabama, make fun of people in Mississippi, and people in prison, make fun of people in graduate school. You laugh, but wait till you get there. Graduate school, I mean. I hope. I did go through 5 years of graduate school. I got my Ph.D. in economics only to decide that I wanted to do stand-up comedy. You can imagine how much this thrilled my father. He told me I'd never make it as a stand-up economist, and I said, why not? And he said, because there's no demand. I'll be here all night. I said, don't worry, Dad, I'm a supply-side economist. I just stand up and let the jokes trickle down. I believe in the Laffer curve. One person, thank you. Sometimes those are the best jokes. Before we go any further, I should show you my t-shirt. It's my I Enjoy Capitalism t-shirt. Made in China. If you look at the tag on the back, it's actually 80% cotton and 20% irony. Dry clean only. I did live in China. I figured if I was going to work on climate change, I should know something about China. So I got finagled a position in Beijing for 5 months in 2011. I want to show you this is the view from my apartment window. I lived in a housing complex in Beijing that houses 400,000 people. Yeah, and I was one of 2 non-Chinese people who lived there. It was me and the guy that everybody there referred to as the black guy. And then one day, I was walking down the street to the bus stop, and I saw a black guy. And I kind of lost my sense of propriety a little bit, right? Like, I'm not super proud of this, but I sort of stared at him a little bit, and finally I walked up to him, and I sort of pointed at him, and I said, you must be the... But before I could get the words out, he pointed at me. And he said, you must be the white guy. Sure enough, he was the black guy. I was the white guy. He was from Ghana. He was there on a scholarship. Super nice guy. We went to McDonald's. We had lunch. International sign of friendship. Anyway, this is the view from my apartment window. About 5% of the time, it looked like this. Much more often, the view from my apartment window looked like that. So yeah, so some pretty serious pollution problems in China. I want to share with you a little bit of another sort of economics comedy routine that I've developed. So this is called What to Expect When You're Expecting the Nobel Prize. So here's what to expect if you're expecting the Nobel Prize. So first of all, you should expect an early morning phone call from a long-dead economist. So this is the Nobel Prize in economics we're talking about, which is not a real Nobel Prize, but that's okay. So if you win the Nobel Prize in economics, then you get a phone call that comes at kind of a reasonable hour Sweden time, but it's 6 o'clock in the morning on the East Coast and 3 o'clock in the morning on the West Coast. They tell you that you won the Nobel Prize, and then they call you back 5 minutes later and do a phone interview and transcribe it and post the transcript on the internet for everybody to see. So here are some of the excerpts from the interview with, this is with Edmund Phelps. And the interview is being conducted by the editor-in-chief of the Nobel Prize website, whose name is, well, you'll see in a moment what his name is. So here's the interview. Hello, may I speak to Professor Phelps, please? And he says, who's calling? And the guy says, I'm calling from the Nobel Foundation, and my name is Adam Smith. And Edmund Phelps just starts cracking up, right? Like, here's this phone call at 4 o'clock in the morning from some guy called Adam Smith telling him that he's won the Nobel Prize. And Adam Smith says, I know it could be a hoax call with a name like that. It's a terrible burden I carry. So one of the cool things about these interviews is you get to see sort of the human side of some of these super famous economists. So I don't know how many of you confess to reading Us magazine, but I think that they should start running a little segment called Nobel Prize Winners. They're just like us. So here's another example. This is the interview with Leonard Hurwitz and his wife, Evelyn. So Leonard Hurwitz, the oldest person to win the Nobel Prize in any field, not just economics. So here's the interview with him and his wife. Adam Smith calls up and says, good morning, Professor Hurwitz. And he's like, hello? And his wife says he's hard of hearing. And so Adam Smith says, I'm sorry, I'll speak louder. Can you hear me now? And his wife says yes. He's not the only one who's a game theorist. Right? And then, thank you, my name is Adam Smith, and ha ha ha, and they all start laughing again. So I have a couple of cartoon economics books, and one of the things that we have in the books that's kind of fun is we try to explain what people won the Nobel Prize for in sort of fun and interesting ways. So here's Jim Tobin saying, don't put all your eggs in one basket, and the King of Sweden says, congratulations, you win the Nobel Prize. And this is actually based on a true story. So he won the Nobel Prize partly for something called portfolio selection theory, which is about building optimal portfolios, trading off risk and reward, all that sort of stuff. So when he went to Sweden to get the Nobel Prize, at the press conference, the reporters said, well, tell us about portfolio selection theory. And Tobin started talking about alpha and beta and whatever. And the reporters said, no, that's too hard, make it simple. And so Tobin said, well, it's kind of like don't put all your eggs in one basket. And then the next day, headlines around the world said, economist wins Nobel Prize for don't put all your eggs in one basket. So this is actually true. You can see this in his obituary. He died maybe 10 years ago. The other ones we just made up. Here's Gary Becker saying sometimes crime does pay. Becker's at the University of Chicago, won the Nobel Prize for applying economic ideas to things we don't necessarily think about as being economics, like crime and drug addiction and interpersonal, interfamily dynamics. John Nash figured out the optimal strategy for rock, paper, scissors. So he's, of course, laid one of the foundations of game theory. It was in the movie and the book A Beautiful Mind. I was just over in Fine Hall, which has a history with John Nash, of course. So that was a special moment for me today. Joseph Stiglitz says sometimes the invisible hand is invisible because it's not there, which is a classic Stiglitz line. Daniel Kahneman says human beings are not as rational. Kahneman is also here on campus, I believe, and he's a psychologist, won the Nobel Prize in economics for laying the foundations of what we now call behavioral economics, looking at to what extent do people actually behave the way that rational economic models say that they do. Eleanor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize a couple years ago. She says there's more than one way to scale a fish. So she won for looking at tragedy of the common situations around the world, especially fisheries, and studying the extent to which local communities could address those problems. And then someday, somebody, my vote is for Marty Weitzman at Harvard, is going to win the Nobel Prize for the idea that the way to get people to pollute less is to make polluting expensive. So this is also an idea that I work on when I do serious academic work and policy work. And so in particular, I work on climate change issues, and I just want to talk you through this really quick. So sort of everything that I think you need to know about climate change in just a couple of slides. And I should say, I actually make a living doing stand-up comedy about economics, and I entertain a lot of audiences that are a lot more conservative than this audience. So think like the Barry Goldwater Institute in Phoenix, Arizona, the Florida Bankers Association, trucking executives on the banks of the Arkansas River, that sort of stuff. So I will give you the same climate change pitch that I give them, which starts out with this fact that carbon concentrations in the atmosphere are going up. Nobody really doubts that this is primarily caused by human activity, right? Burning fossil fuels and deforestation primarily. Then we have this theory that says that if carbon concentrations go up, global temperatures are going to go up. This theory actually predates Al Gore. They laughed at that joke more in Arkansas. It goes all the way back to this fellow, Arrhenius, who was a chemist in Sweden, and in 1896, he made the first estimate of how much global temperatures would increase if we doubled CO2 in the atmosphere, which we're on track to do kind of the middle of this century. And his estimate from 1896, about 5 degrees Celsius, 9 degrees Fahrenheit, is still pretty close to the range that climate scientists talk about today. The big difference between where he was then and where we are now is that he thought that climate change was going to be awesome because he lived in Sweden. And we tend to be a little more worried about changing the basic functionings of planet Earth. In any case, we've been running this experiment on planet Earth for the last 150 years or so, and here are the results of the experiment. The blue dots are individual years, going back to the 1880s. The red bars are 10-year average temperatures, going up through the 1970s. Then there's the 1980s, there's the 1990s, there's the 2000s, for what it's worth. There's the first few years of this decade. Temperatures going up pretty much in line with the projections of climate science. Now, if you happen to not believe that humans are partly responsible for increasing global temperatures, I will try to find common ground with you anyway. And the common ground comes from the way that economists think about pollution problems, which, like I said, is that the way to get less pollution is to make polluting expensive. Because when you make polluting expensive, you get market forces working to promote conservation and innovation, development of new technologies, all the things that I, at least, love about capitalism. Right, so what I work on as an environmental economist is sort of using the tools of economics and the power of capitalism to protect the environment. A couple of policy tools to talk about, like a carbon tax or an auction cap and trade system, but the point of those policy tools is to drive up the price of fossil fuels. This is generally the part in my talk where people stop laughing, right? Because it's hard to convince people that we should be paying more for gasoline and electricity and things like this, but there is a side benefit to these policies, other than the main benefit of, like potentially saving the world. And the side benefit is that if you do these policies right, you generate a pile of revenue. Government can do all sorts of stuff with that revenue. The idea that I work on and talk to folks about is that we could be using most or all of that revenue to reduce or eliminate existing taxes. So it's called environmental tax reform or tax shifting. Right? The idea being that if we had higher taxes on things we want less of, like carbon emissions, then we could afford to have lower taxes on things we want more of, like jobs and income and savings and investment. And this is where I find common ground, even with folks like George Will, columnist for the Washington Post, pretty conservative fellow. He came to one of my classes a few years ago. He doesn't believe that humans are partly responsible for increasing global temperatures, but I asked him if he would support replacing part of the payroll tax, part of the employment tax in this country, with a carbon tax. And he said that he was all for it because he hates the payroll tax. And with unemployment at 7 or 8%, I hate the payroll tax. Right? And Al Gore hates the payroll tax. Al Gore says we should tax what we burn and not what we earn. So I asked George Will what he thought about the fact that he and Al Gore agreed on this particular issue. And George Will said, well, he said, an idea should not be held responsible for the people who believe in it. In any case, sort of economists across the political spectrum think that this is a good idea, and there's even a place that's done this. So I live in Seattle. To my north, the Canadian province of British Columbia has what many economists consider to be the best climate policy in the world, implemented by a right-of-center government in British Columbia. It's a 100% revenue-neutral carbon tax. So here's what it looks like. The money that comes in from the carbon tax is $30 per ton of CO2, so that's the equivalent of about 30 cents a gallon of gasoline. So that's a chunk. All the money that comes in from the carbon tax is used to reduce personal and corporate income taxes in the province of British Columbia. There's an offset for low-income households. Really a terrifically smart policy. Policy's been in place since 2008, and we can actually see how it's worked in British Columbia compared to Canada as a whole. So here's petroleum product sales, and Canada is in blue, British Columbia is in green. My title for this slide is Economics Works. Right? Like when you make something more expensive, people buy less of it. We can also look at how the economy is doing in British Columbia. It's actually doing just as well as Canada as a whole. So really a tremendously successful policy. To give you a sense of how this might work in a more local area, so I work on this issue in Washington State, kind of in an activist perspective. To give you sense of how this might work in New Jersey, if you had the same policy they have in British Columbia, so fossil fuel emissions in New Jersey, about 130 million tons of CO2 per year. So if you had the same tax, $30 per ton of CO2, right, that would generate maybe $3.5 billion a year in the state of New Jersey. It would reduce emissions by 10 or 15%. Right? So that's $400 a person. That's the incentive that people have to think about what kind of car do you drive and how far do you live from work and is your home insulated and how much do you fly and all that sort of stuff. What could you do with that kind of money in the state of New Jersey? To put it in the context of the rest of the state tax system, the state business tax is $2 billion, sales tax is $8 billion, income tax brings in about $10 billion a year. So you could generate some pretty substantial reductions in those other taxes. So this is the idea that I work on in Washington State and sort of proselytize for elsewhere. So I want to thank you for letting me share that with you. And I have one final point that I want to make on this, which is this is my explanation for why I think this is important. And it has to do with something that I call the 5 Chinas theory of the world. This is my own theory. I'm very proud of this. The 5 Chinas theory of the world says you take the world population, which is how many people? 7 billion. You divide by 5, you get 1.4 billion, which is approximately the population of China, right? So you can divide the world up into 5 population groups the size of China. So China, India, everybody else in Asia, about the same population as China, right? So there's a lot of people in Asia, right? The OECD is the rich world, so North America, Europe, Japan, South Korea, a couple other random countries, and then everybody else is principally Africa and South America. So to think back to the joke I told earlier, in very broad, overgeneralized strokes, if you divide the world up into 5 people, you get a white person, a black person, and 3 Asian people, right? This is important because if you look at fossil fuel consumption in these 5 Chinas, you get this picture at the beginning of this century. Right? The rich world is responsible for about half of world CO2 emissions, and I think one of the big stories of this century is going to be economic growth and development in the rest of the world. We've seen it in China. Hopefully, there are many strong arguments for hoping that that's going to continue in China. Hopefully, India is going to catch up. Hopefully, Africa. Right? And there's a lot of positives about that, and I think that's going to be one of the big stories of this century. I think the other big story is dealing with some of the environmental impacts of having 7 billion people growing to 10 or 11 billion people who are all trying to live the lifestyles that we live. So now, ladies and gentlemen, I will go back to telling you jokes. So thank you for putting up with that. Although I did this once for a very conservative crowd in Minnesota, and this fellow came up to me at the end of my talk and said that the stuff I said about climate change was the funniest part of my whole routine. True story. I should mention, so I got these cartoon economics books, and I've got a cartoon introduction to climate change that's coming out in June. If anybody's interested in econ books, I have some copies I'm happy to sell you at my cost. Actually, less than my cost. I have the Amazon.com sort of mentality about this. Do I have 5 minutes to do one other little bit? Or are we out of time? So I have a bit that I haven't done in a really long time, but it does have kind of an environmental twist to it. But in order to do this, first of all, you have to be excited about this, and then you have to put yourselves in the perspective of like 2004. So like the Bush presidency. So when I started doing comedy, I figured comedy about economics was too hard, so I started developing some material about comedy about the war in Iraq. So do you want to see it? You want to see this? All right. So we have to pretend that you're in 2004, right? And I want to start with this. I don't care about how you feel about the war. I don't care how you feel about President Bush. I think the individual troops that are over there deserve our support, so I hope you join me in a round of applause. Very good. I can't believe I have to give a disclaimer before asking for a round of applause for the troops. But the political situation in our country, ladies and gentlemen, has become so divisive. I experienced that divisiveness firsthand a few years ago when I moved from liberal Seattle to conservative Eastern Washington with a bumper sticker on my car. I brought a copy to show you today. The bumper sticker said, "Bring the troops home." Not a big deal in Seattle, right? But after getting my ass kicked multiple times outside of Barnaby's pub in Walla Walla, I decided I needed to do something different, right? So I traded in that bumper sticker. I got a new bumper sticker that said, "Leave the troops there." That one didn't work either. So then I got a new bumper sticker, right? I traded that one in too, and I got a bumper sticker that said I went for something neutral. I said, "I don't know about the troops." Me too. Yes, I am selling these bumper stickers, and can I just say that this is going much better than when I did this routine in Texas last month? No, because when I did this routine in Texas last month, this great big Jew jumped up in the back, and he was like, "That is the most offensive bumper sticker I've ever seen." Well, maybe I've been hanging around academia too long or something, but I took that as a challenge. I looked at him and I said, "You think this is the most offensive bumper sticker you've ever seen?" And I reached into my backpack and I said, "I bet you haven't seen this bumper sticker. This bumper sticker says if the troops weren't all in Iraq, I'd shoot one myself." Now this, I said, this is an offensive bumper sticker. Ladies and gentlemen, you should have seen the look on this guy's face. I knew that I had won the argument about which was the more offensive bumper sticker. What I didn't know was that he was going to be an incredibly sore loser. Apparently what I thought of as my rights under the First Amendment were in conflict with what he thought of as his rights under the Second Amendment. But I'm like the president, people. I don't back down. So when this guy asked me if I was selling this bumper sticker too, I said, "Heck yes, how many would you like to buy?" And he flipped out. He jumped up on the stage. He ripped the bumper sticker out of my hand. He got right up in my face. He said, "I would never buy that bumper sticker and put it on my car." And I said, "You dumbass. You're not supposed to put it on your own car." No, there are instructions. The instructions are right on the back. Step 1, locate Hummer. Step 2, place over gas tank. Step 3, run. just in case anybody doubts where I'm going, like, I totally support the troops, right? I have extra respect for the military because I'd be such a terrible fit for the military. I mean, like, look at my arms. I'm like human veal. If I went to boot camp, I'd be afraid the drill sergeant would tell me to drop and give him 5 push-ups. I can't remember the last time I ran a mile. I mean, as far as the military is concerned, I have only one thing going for me. I'm not openly homosexual. But if they reinstate the draft, ladies and gentlemen, that is going to change in a snap. I'm still working on my snaps. That's just the military's policy, though, right? If you're out, you can't get in. You can't even get by if you're bi. So if they reinstate the draft, gay is going to be the new Canada. I want to be there. Thank you.
This one right here. Okay, and like I said, Yoram's doing a show tonight, 9:30, Campus Club. We're going to be there. These guys are going to be there with a couple of student acts, including one of my students, yes, who I think is not here because he's writing his act. Okay, so now I'm going to give you the answer to this one. Dear JJ, I've been trying in vain to locate guns and ammunition with less toxic materials to use at work. Can you help me? I can't tell you what I do exactly or I might have to kill you, but I can say that I work alone, that I use guns in a lethal manner on a regular basis, and that despite my commitment to reduce, reuse, and recycle, I often have to discard a gun after I've used it. JN, no home address. And this one was tough because I'm actually trying to give advice on 2 different issues, not just green issues. Dear JN, wow, seriously, a hitman? Wow. Well, okay, guns don't kill people, right? People do, as the NRA always says. And in the US alone, people use guns to kill at least 12,000 people a year. This one's really funny. The bullets often end up in the soils, and some of the guns get tossed into our rivers. So shouldn't we at least act responsibly to green up all these guns and bullets for the planet? And, you know, for the people who aren't killed by the people who use guns that don't kill people to kill people. Glock did introduce green versions of 7 of its popular handgun models in 2004, which seemed really exciting until it turned out that the guns were actually just green instead of black. And while there's been a big push to develop lead-free hunting ammo, and likewise to make the bullets at firing ranges more eco-friendly, the vast quantity of bullets that people use to shoot people continue to pump lead into the soil. The good news is that the US military is showing a real and growing commitment to sustainable practices, which includes solar-powered tents and the development of biofuels for fighter jets. The bad news is that it's moving slowly on technologies to green up firearms. And the worst news is that we seem to be losing the green arms race to the British. Yes, that's right, the British. Since 2006, the Ministry of Defense, spelled D-E-F-E-N-C-E, because it's Britain, has contracted with the arms manufacturer Titan BAE to develop green ammunition, explaining that the lead in bullets, quote, this is all real, can harm the environment and pose a risk to people. They're moving, too, to develop, also true, quieter bombs to reduce noise pollution, and compostable explosives that can break down into manure, all in a cutting-edge effort to enrich enemy soil. Seriously, the British, whom the American Army first defeated 235 years ago in the very war that inspired the Second Amendment right to own guns because a well-regulated militia is necessary, which is exactly what now guarantees the right to conceal a 9mm semi-automatic handgun with a 10-shot clip in your pocket so you can kill someone when they nab your parking space. If you don't think that happens, actually Google sometime gun, homicide, parking space, and you'll be amazed at what comes up. Pages and pages. Of course, we all know that will ultimately absolutely make the difference if each and every individual gun consumer can green up his or her own guns and bullets at home and at work, which is why we need to see Glock and other manufacturers produce toxic-free guns and ammo for the retail markets. And we need to see this happen especially in the United States, since people just don't kill such huge numbers of people in Britain, Australia, and other countries with gun control laws that do more than require people without criminal records to wait up to 3 days before they can shoot someone. Of course, I do have to encourage you at the same time, and please don't be angry now, to put as much consideration into reducing your impact not just on the environment, but on people. Have you considered, for example, that for every person you shoot, you might make a substantial donation to the Brady Campaign to Prevent Gun Violence? Or to the Violence Policy Center, which hasn't tried so hard to assure would-be homicidal maniacs that it's not trying to prevent them from buying a gun as long as they've committed no previous crimes, have never truly scared a psychiatrist, and have the patience to wait, up to 3 days. Or to the Gun Control Network in Britain, since they did have 51 gun homicides in the UK last year, in England, Scotland, and Wales combined. In other words, when one family grieves anywhere, it's enormously important that another should be spared anywhere else. Your personal actions in one place should in no way increase the total number of homicides across the globe. And more, if you donate enough to prevent more than one homicide for each one you commit, then you can actually even save lives every time you carry out a contract. In the meantime, purchase carbon offsets when you fly internationally, rent the fastest possible hybrids when you drive, shred and recycle your files after you're done with them. Just all the obvious stuff. You know what it is. Wow.
So this is just, I just read.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to try and gross you out now. I've always been big on grossing people out ever since I was about 5 years old. And I found it very funny, not necessarily the people that were on the receiving end of this. But this is, my mentor, Michael Pollan, really had the innovation of using food to show that we're connected to the environment, that the stuff that we eat is this line between us and the natural world. And so this is about how your pork comes to you, so to speak. This is, I went to a farm to see this, run by a guy named Ryan Watchie. The boars were as big and as furry as bears. Each had his own pen. But in the last stall, in place of a pig, was what looked like a blue plastic saddle, standing a few feet off the ground. Watchie opened this gate and led a white boar into the corral. "I've been training this one," Watchie said. "We'll see how he does." The boar walked straight up to the dummy and mounted without hesitation. Now, to be fair, this is a position that few mammals are able to maintain with grace. But this boar, no doubt due to his lack of experience, made the pose look particularly awkward. One foreleg bent under his body, his back arched, and his head lolled on the saddle. Watchie reached under the pig's belly with one latex-gloved hand and squeezed a stream of clear liquid onto the ground. "You want to get the urine out of there," he said. "Then you just hold onto the penis, which can be difficult because it's slimy." He looked at my face and laughed. "Sometimes it's so slippery I have to take the glove off to hold on." The tip of the boar's penis is shaped like a corkscrew, which gives the farmer something to grip. The hog doesn't need friction, just pressure. The boar, meanwhile, was shifting, working his way around the dummy. Perhaps he had realized that things were not going quite according to plan and had hit on the idea that he'd picked the wrong end. Watchie rolled his eyes and hung on. When the moment came, he signaled me and I handed him the cup, an insulated coffee mug lined with a plastic bag covered in cheesecloth. Watchie pulled the penis, 2 feet long and pencil thin, to the cup's mouth and held it for 3 long minutes as the boar ejaculated. Then Watchie took the cup inside. It held about half a pint. "Usually I'll dilute it, but I'm out of distilled water," he said, breaking what had become an uncomfortable silence. "Do you ever stop in the middle of that and think, 'I'm holding a boar's penis'?" I blurted. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So we're going to have lots of time for your comments and jokes and routines, whatever you like. But I thought we'd just start off a little bit, just that each person, give each of us just a couple minutes, really, very briefly, just to talk about why we insist on being so serious. But why we use comedy to address environmental issues, and I know one of the comments that I get all the time, both as an environmental writer and environmental historian, is, wow, that's the first funny thing we've ever read about environment. So I think it does tend to be more, a lot rarer to do it. So I thought, if each of us could just speak maybe to that issue just for a couple minutes. Or
I'll start. I mean, I think I aspire to be funny, and I'm not always funny, but in part it's an outgrowth of having grown up in a town where everybody was really serious, and there were all these very grim hippies going around saying that we're doomed, and the whole we're going to hell in a handbasket, and yet I'm still driving a car and doing all these things, and it's just a really depressing way to be. And so I think if you're laughing, it means you're human and you're dealing with the real world, and you're not creating false abstractions. And so I find that when I'm funny, people are a little bit more willing to listen, and they're less liable to think that I'm just leading them down a BS path.
So I think I agree with everything that Nate and Jenny said about this. Comedy can be kind of humanizing, sort of on both ends, and the environmental movement can use some of that humanizing. I think that from comedy allows you to also tell self-deprecating jokes, and that can be a great way to open yourself up and make yourself vulnerable to the audience, which is important if you're asking them to do something like change their behavior to deal with climate change, or deal with other kinds of changes. So I like to tell my audiences a joke about how I speak Spanish pretty well, but not perfectly. As I learned a few years ago, this was well before I was married, and I was down in Ecuador practicing my Spanish in a bar with a young woman. And finally she turned to me and she said in Spanish, she said, "If you're so great, like, how come you're not married?" And I wanted to say something sort of flirtatiously self-deprecating, like, I don't know, maybe women just don't like me. And what I ended up saying was, "Tal vez no me gustan las mujeres," which means maybe I don't like women. So that sort of joke, like, I don't know, I feel like it does a pretty good job of allowing the audience to see that I'm actually a human being underneath my dour economist exterior. So comedy can be good for that. And then I feel like it just opens doors. I mean, I would have a hard time going to trucking executives on the banks of the Arkansas River and talking to them about climate change, and with that as the lead. But as I mentioned to the class, I sometimes think, so if you make people laugh for 50 minutes, you can talk to them about whatever you want for 5 or 10 minutes, and they'll be okay. They may not agree with you or buy it, but they'll listen. They'll tolerate it. And so I sometimes talk about the climate change part that I do in my comedy bit as being the pill that I put inside the ball of meat that I feed to the dog. And so comedy is the ball of meat, and it opens up opportunities that you wouldn't otherwise have.
So I agree with everything Nate and Yoram just said. But I use comedy, I think, mostly a little bit differently, at least in the work I'm doing now, in that I think comedy is great for opening up people to environmental ideas, but I think it's also great for critiquing environmentalism, and a lot of my work is really about critiquing environmentalist culture and trying to get us to think about environmentalism differently. And I think comedy is, what does it do? It turns the world upside down. It shows you things differently that you take for granted. So I think that's a lot of what I'm trying to do. And the genesis of my Green Me Up JJ column was really that that I think that the question, why isn't environment funny, to me is a really interesting substantive question. Like, why aren't environmentalists funny, and why do they have this reputation for being so sanctimonious and self-righteous? And I think that it's actually, the answer is really, I really see as a kind of, my students have heard me say this many times, was kind of a wormhole into some really interesting, important questions about the state of environmentalism and environmentalist rhetoric, environmentalist ideas. And to me, I'm really grappling with the I think, really deeply historically rooted association of environmental action with personal virtue, which has led, I think, to a culture of emphasis on, virtuous individual actions that I feel has often actually gotten completely ridiculous and out of hand and counterproductive. And so I feel like, if you want to go after the association of nature with virtue, what better way to do it than to actually, with irony and sarcasm. The catch-22 being that environmentalists don't always get that you're being funny. So just to end, I gave a talk at Stanford once where they had to read something and included some JJ stuff, including my gun thing, and this one woman says, very, very serious environmentalist, so I was actually living in her house, said, what I really love, what I think is really important about this column is it shows that you can own guns and still be an environmentalist. It's like if that didn't get it, I don't know what else to do, So anyway, so I think funniness I think has a lot of usefulness, in many different ways. Do you want to?
Well, I think the most useful thing for me about comedy is that it forces you to be a little bit more truthful. That you can't have these just sort of abstract statements out there that sound very grand. If you're actually trying to be funny, you have to ground it in real life and in the body and in grossness and things like that. And so I think where the environmental movement often goes wrong is being too disembodied and airy and not funny.
I would just caution that you have to be careful about not telling lies in order to get laughs, and that's hard. Because sometimes, everybody's seen comedy, things from Rush Limbaugh or whoever, where they're like, global warming, like, I had to put a sweater on yesterday, So it can be difficult to have sort of two masters and to try to optimize with respect to both making something funny and conveying a serious message, and both of those things are hard independently, and to put them together can be a challenge.
Yeah, I actually struggle with that in my column sometimes. Do I just make up stuff, or usually doesn't work as well. I just want to ask one more question before we open up, which is, do you get people accuse you of being trivial about serious issues? Do you get negative reactions to your use of trying to use humor to address these issues that you actually really care deeply about?
Maybe you should answer that first. I just feel I don't think I'm funny often enough to get people. It would be nice if I got blamed for being too funny. I think that I would get a little patch or something.
Just grist.
But yeah, so I work for an environmental or a green online news source called Grist. That one of the innovations was to try and be funny about the environment. Based on failures, the founder was going around, this guy, Chip Giller, was walking around Brown and carrying all of his trash that he produced, and this was sort of this performance art piece, and it was like very serious, and he expected people to see this, be like, oh my gosh, that's a lot of trash. We've got to change our lives, and everybody just ignored him, and so this was his idea, that he could act more like he acted around his friends, with the people that he wanted to talk to. But certainly, I think Grist gets pushback both from environmentalists who are saying all you're doing is these jokes. It doesn't deepen our understanding of these issues, and from people who are critiquing stories that we're doing, saying, you're making fun of us, but actually got this story totally wrong. You need to know more about this before you try and make a joke.
So some of my comedy pushes boundaries a little bit. When I was actually developing the bumper stickers routine, especially if you think back to where we were in 2004, I like to think that as being a pretty hard-hitting routine. Right, and I did an open mic night once where the routine was much less polished than it is now. And I had a guy who'd just come back from Iraq come up in my face after the routine, and he was like, I I really am offended, and I'm going to wait for you in the parking lot and whoop your ass. Fortunately, I took the bus that night. But I felt like for me personally, it was good to hear that, and it's good to, as a comic, I feel like it's good to challenge yourself in audiences. So I've gone to West Point and done that routine because it's not an anti-troops routine. I don't want it to be, and if they're taking it that way, then that means I'm doing something wrong with the routine, right? So I feel like pushing boundaries a little bit, and I pushed boundaries a little bit here. I told that joke about how there were 400,000 Chinese people, right? And I was only one of two non-Chinese people living in this place in Beijing, me and a guy that everybody called the black guy. And when I talk with liberal audiences, there's a lot of like, oh, am I allowed to laugh at that joke? Like and there's clearly a sense of like, where is he going with this, right? And people are uncomfortable. And one of the reasons I tell that joke is to actually relate it to this Five Chinas thing, because I think that has some important intellectual content to it in a way of thinking about the world. And ultimately, the white guy, black guy thing, I think takes care of, I hope, any concerns that there are kind of bad racial overtones in the stuff that I was saying. I think that there was one last thing that I was going to say about this, and I don't remember what it was, so I will stop there.
Yeah, I mean, one of the tough things about humor, I think my students are seeing too, is that it's really hard to get it right. It's really hard to get people to laugh and to get it right. I'm sure all of us did jokes that you went, so it takes a long time. So I think it's a little riskier. So I find that I've had criticism for being snarky and making fun of people, but it's usually more, when you look at it, it's less criticism about the fact that I'm trying to be funny than what I'm actually doing, what I'm actually critiquing. And they don't think that's useful, because why should environmentalists critique environmentalists? Don't we have enough problems without division among ourselves, which I think is a really super spurious and dangerous argument. But but I think that it's easy to go after the humor, as the target instead of the critique. You want to open it up? Should we open it up? And I want to actually give my students first crack at questions. Nada. Yeah.
I was wondering if you thought that being a hitman or hitwoman is really the most you can be doing to curb carbon emissions.
I'm sorry. If being
that could be a different take
so
on.
One thing that you didn't address in your column is that killing people is reducing
right.
carbon to zero.
Yeah.
So aren't really they doing the most they can possibly be doing?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I clearly haven't thought this through quite enough. I need to go back and rewrite that column, so thank you. Yeah, there needs to be a part 2, definitely. Yeah. Kind of like we saw the Onion piece where they create a new Prius that kills the owner. Where you get in and you strap your seatbelt on and there's a spike that drives through. There's the family van where a spike drives through. There's one where that actually they can compost the people. I don't know. So yeah. I mean, people are thinking out there that, they're kind of thinking that we need to have to.
So I'll say this. One of the reasons why I think it's to answer the second question you asked about, well, what if people come up and challenge you about being serious about environmental issues? I think it's important. Like, one thing that I like about the comedy stuff that I do is that there is an underlying point to it. I mean, I do get to talk to people about climate change and carbon taxes and things that I think are valuable. And I think Jenny and I may disagree about this a little bit, but just getting to the point where you come dangerously close to just sort of mocking people for owning Priuses. And I can see why people would think that that was a little mean. Like, if that's where you're going to leave it.
Yeah, we're going to disagree.
Yeah. Do I own a Prius? No. I own a 2002 Toyota Echo, which is like a Prius, but it's cheaper and gets almost as good gas mileage. Yes, it's what an economist would buy.
Yeah, and I think, again, there's no one reason to be funny. There's no one style of being funny. So, some humor is going to be more offensive, grosser, less gross, gentler. I see Grist as actually having a really beautiful, sort of gentle sense of humor. Some of it's going to be more biting, and it really, it's not like just being funny is a good thing or a bad thing. It's a strategy. And you have to know why you're using it, and the answer to that is going to be different depending on what it is you're trying to achieve. I think there are really legitimate reasons for going after the whole I own a Prius, therefore I am green goddess culture, you know, because I don't think the Priuses themselves are bad, but I think that the Prius as a status symbol has actually become quite problematic, and is bound up with, you know, bigger problems. But, you know, it depends on, you know, being, you know, then also what are the risks, right, of being funny, and who do you lose? And, you know, who's your intended audience? So there's no set answers, I think, to any of these questions. Another of my students, and then we'll open it up. Adam.
Yeah. Do you ever come to a point with something that you're working on where you're at a place where you can either make it more funny, or you can, and there's a piece where you have a message that you're trying to get across, and you can either make it more funny, or you could be more devoted to the message. Do you ever come to a place where like those two things come directly in conflict? And if so, how do you deal with that?
I mean, yes, I would shift it slightly. For me, I as a journalist, I don't try and promote a message. I'm just trying to see what's out there. But certainly, there's some times where I'll see a joke and it won't have anything to do with the story I'm telling. You know, it will take me down like a completely different path, or and you know. I don't know if it's the right answer, but for me, I end up, you know, first and foremost a journalist, and so I stick to just the facts. But I think it is worth, if you work hard enough and have enough time, there often is a little nugget there within the facts. Whether it's, sometimes it isn't a pure joke, maybe sometimes it's just a little bit more graceful or entertaining writing, or a way of conveying the facts that's not as dry or more narrative than usual.
So I'll answer the question by admitting that what I usually do when I do like an hour-long comedy routine is I'll tell the audience that I'm going to spend 5 minutes talking to them pretty seriously about climate change. So I'll interrupt the comedy routine, and I would love to not do that. Like I did. Described the comedy bit or the climate bit that I do as the pill that I put inside the ball of meat that I feed to the dog. I would love to have like a meat pill that I put inside the ball of meat that I feed to the dog, right? But it's hard, right? So that's how that's the way that I deal with it. And I mean, there are a couple. I try to put as many jokes as I can into that bit, and I try to do it fast. So there's like the joke about Al Gore. And there's the joke about Iranians living in Sweden. So I try to put a couple of jokes in there, but mostly it's serious stuff because I can't figure out how to make it funnier.
Right, there's always that question of what topics are off limits, right? Let's open up. Does other folks have routines, or, well, Jacob?
Earlier in the year, you took us to the filming of Jon Stewart, and oh, I'm not supposed to share that. Take this class, it's great. And in my opinion, he's probably like the comedian who's the most in the public's view right now, even though his job right now is to be like semi-news anchor, but he's essentially a comedian. He says that he's first a comedian, and then secondly has his message. And you kind of said the opposite, that you're first a journalist, and then have your comedy message. And so my thought is, like, what do you guys have to say to people like me who may be in the future like the head of a sustainability something, as to like how can we address this like balance?
Being a comedian or being...
Yeah.
Or the message.
Yeah.
I don't actually really believe Jon Stewart when he says that, to be honest. I mean, he's always insisting, I'm a comedian, you shouldn't take me seriously, I don't do news. But I think, I mean, in many ways, Jon Stewart is my model when I try to be funny, and that I feel like he is someone who is deadly serious about what he's talking about, because he's using humor as a strategy to talk about it. And I feel like, you know, everything we're talking about is ultimately, we're really deadly serious about it, I think. I mean, we're not just trying to make fun of people or, you know, or be funny or have people laugh at us or with us. So, yeah, I'm not sure and I don't think you have to choose one or the other.
I think it's something that everybody just has to struggle with. Yeah, and there's different answers for different roles, right? I think there's a place for someone like me and a place for someone like Jon Stewart. And you know, if you're in charge of a sustainability messaging campaign or something for a business or what have you, then you know, then I think you're somewhere in between, right? And I'm highly confident that you'll find exactly the right stance.
I don't have anything to add.
Go back to the question of audience, because each of you does a different kind of comedy, and I think you are either performing by choice or by venue for different kinds of readers. And I wonder, when you go in to work on a bit or write a column response or work on the book, are you thinking of an ideal reader and some kind of action you want to take that reader to do at the end, or is it broader? Is that too confined?
So with the comedy routines, I don't make a living for talking to people about climate change. I make a living for making people laugh about economics. So that's the thing that's foremost in my mind. Like that's my job. So I need to keep that front and center. The cartoon books are a little different in that the cartoon books are kind of a mix of fun and educational content. And so those, I feel like I have a little more flexibility to say, hey, we're not going to have a joke on this page, and that's okay.
I mean, I think of an ideal reader. I imagine is it not? I think it's feeding into the camera at least. That's. But you want me to talk up a little, speak up a little? I just sort of imagine, you know, that I'm writing for a good friend and trying to make a good friend laugh and keep them from kind of tuning out. You know, if I'm in a situation like this, that people would be, even if I'm writing something that for pages isn't funny per se, that people would still not start looking at their iPhones. And it's a little different writing a book. You know, it's sort of this vast unknown. You like seclude yourself in a little hermit's cave and you scribble away and you kind of imagine of who your audience would be, and you don't know if there's anybody that's going to actually be like that. I think there was like 2 for this book. And now writing for the web, it's really interesting because there's this instant gratification where you see if people get the jokes, they'll comment on it or they'll tweet about it, or they'll completely miss it and be like, I can't believe you said that. So I don't know if anybody saw it. William Salatin did a parody of, there was a guy that was drummed out of a tech company, Mozilla, because he'd given to the initiative against gay marriage in California. And so he wrote this whole thing for Slate about how, well, look, I found that there's actually 15,000 other people in tech companies that gave to this. And so, you know, we've got to do this purge, and here's how it's going to take a long time, and all these people, you know, and then at the end, there's a line that said, or we should maybe put down our pitchforks if we don't want to go through with this and be fair about it. But a lot of people didn't get that or read to that line, and like Fox News didn't get that, you know. So they didn't want to get it. Yes. Yeah, they don't want to get it. But so it is interesting when you do stuff online, you get this immediate like, oh, that's the audience that I'm speaking to. That's interesting.
I think it's so. Can I add on something on that? So I think it's valuable to write for somebody who's a friend, but some of the experiences for me in comedy in particular have been valuable coming at it from the other end and really thinking about what an antagonist would say about this. Like before I did this routine at West Point, like I thought about it a little bit, right? It's something that I still think about. I did my whole comedy and climate change and carbon taxes routine in Galveston, Texas, and this fellow came up to me before the show. He was there with his high school age daughters, and one of them said, "Hey, I read your cartoon book and I really liked it." And they said, and it turned out he worked in the oil industry, and so I got up and I gave this pitch about how, hey, basically I was trying to put him out of a job, and that affected me. I was like, okay, I need to think about how I'm going to craft what I have to say. That's not going to make him pull his two daughters out of the auditorium and be like, that guy's a jerk. One thing we did in the cartoon climate book that I think was, I don't know how effective this will be in terms of picking up skeptics or on the skeptic side of audiences is, but we went so the first part of the book is about climate science, and we went as far into the book as possible without actually talking about greenhouse gases or words that I would say would trigger a Fox News kind of reaction. So we have an introductory chapter, then we have a chapter about the history of the planet that talks about the carbon cycle, and then we have a chapter about the ice ages that talks about the Milankovitch cycles, and then we have a chapter about CO2 that just talks about the Keeling curve and CO2 is going up. And so you're not until chapter 5 or 6 until you get to, hey, there's this thing called the greenhouse effect. And we actually did that intentionally to try to get as far as we could in terms of trying to stay on solid common ground before coming to something that was going to be hey, I don't think, I'm not comfortable with it.
Yeah, I think, and again, I think this really speaks to different styles of comedy, different purposes for comedy. I think it's a really critical question, who's your audience, especially because comedy is so clearly audience specific, right? I mean, my column's not going to work in China, or a lot of other places, very tailored to American audience. So I think that for me, thinking about audience, that it's one of the things I'm really trying to go after is this greener than now culture, which I think is embedded in ideas of nature, and about nature being this sort of precious, fragile thing that we have to protect, and what could be more virtuous than protecting this kind of precious, real world, the world that was here before us, right? Blah, blah, blah. And I think that is one of the most powerful and deeply embedded and unquestioned assumptions in American culture. And it's really, 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 really hard to get people to think differently about it. And I feel like we have all this stuff going on in environmentalist culture and policy that is really well-intentioned and is completely helping to muck things up, partly by encouraging a class divide. I think there's all kinds of ways that this idea creates a culture, this kind of greener than now culture, and this is why I'm not ashamed to go after Priuses and the sort of Prius as status symbol culture that has really encouraged a class divide, so that the people who should most benefit from environmentalism, right, the people who drink the worst water and breathe the worst air, are the people who are convinced that environmentalism is against their interests. I think that's a really, really, really serious problem, and that's what I'm deadly serious about going after with comedy. So I've been working on that, against that idea, which was sort of my founding religious idea as a younger person, so this is really just kind of tearing down my religion for the rest of my life. But I've been going after that in one way or another with projects throughout my career, and I think I've got, I started out with this nice, friendly book, and people just didn't get it, what I was saying. They said, oh yeah, and they would say exactly the opposite of what, I love your book because, so then I got a little more polemical, and now I'm just getting sarcastic because I feel like, it's a strategy to get, I feel like my audience it's not anti-environmentalists, it's not, it's really people like me, right? People who want to do the right thing, but are doing all kinds of things that really make no sense at all or are actually part of the problem. And so I feel like I'm trying now a strategy that's much more biting, much more aggressive, that will hopefully be hard to miss my point. Now, apparently, there's nothing you can do. Really that comment by that woman was sort of the most discouraging thing that could possibly happen in terms of trying this strategy. Because I'm like, well, now I don't know what to try, other than going up her and screaming at the top of my lungs, and then she probably still won't get it. So. But so that, in terms of audience, I think that's how I'm thinking. Now, also, as I get older, I have less patience with, I don't care as much if people like me, and I have less patience with being nice, and not saying what I think. So, but I think these questions about audience are absolutely critical. And there's different strategies, all of which have their advantages and disadvantages. You guys want to say anything else? Do you want?
Because Jenny's experience with being misunderstood and also what Nate was talking about with the Mozilla story, it's just important to remember that what you want to convey to the audience is not necessarily what the audience is going to hear. And people come away with I mean, you know this from being in classes or teaching classes. People come away from things with just all kinds of ideas that are many degrees separated from where you started. So I feel, that for me, what I take away from that is kind of trying to pick your battles. I used to give a lecture. I used to teach an introduction to environmental studies class, co-teach a class, and I used to give a lecture about how recycling was really not all that important, because recycling is really not all that important. And I stopped giving that lecture because, the students hated me and they came away thinking that I was just this bad economist, evil man. So I stopped. So I feel like you kind of got to pick your battles, and the battle that I've chosen is carbon taxes. God help me.
But do you think that you could rework that material on? I mean, I gave a lecture called "Stop Saving the Planet," like on Earth Day. That'll be my lecture. So, and students just look at you; they're just lost. Like, well, what am I supposed to do then? But do you think there's a way of recasting that lecture so that you could actually do a lecture on why you should stop recycling? No. Or do you think no?
I don't think it's worth it.
Okay.
Since you said there's often this disconnect between what you want to convey and what the audience takes away, what is it that you're most likely to convey today to us, like your most important message for us to take away from this panel, for each of you?
The environment can be funny.
I think the most interesting thing on this topic that I've learned that might be interested in passing on is that the kind of elegiac form of environmental thinking is often wrong, and that humor helps ground it and brings some freshness, if not necessarily, and I think I would say truth as well.
Comedy can open doors. It helps to be vulnerable, make yourself vulnerable, and sometimes you have to take risks, and that can be hard.
And I would say not only can the environment be funny, but I think it's absolutely necessary to make it funny, in part to break down this barrier of sort of righteousness, which I think is actually one of the most serious problems we have in making real progress towards addressing issues like climate change, is this kind of righteous.
Righteousness?
Yes, I do, yeah.
I respectfully disagree.
Go ahead and disagree, that's fine.
I just feel like people who are, holier than thou about their Priuses, there's a million issues that are going on with regards to climate change, for example, and I just don't think that's at the top of the list. I mean, there's the fact that fossil fuels are very attractive. There's money that fossil fuel companies have. There's the fact that the general public doesn't really care all that much about climate change. Those things are hard.
Okay, but those, I think, are really tightly tied to the righteousness about environmentalism. So I think it's not the righteousness per se. It's the problem that the righteousness is part of a deeper problem that I think really shuts out most of the people, including the people who actually will suffer the most from climate change. I think it's part of a whole sort of culture that's really, every time you say we need to save the planet, every time people who are talking about climate change or concerned about climate change is, oh my God, we have to save the planet, you lose 80% of your potential audience. Because the whole idea of saving the planet is not something, people think it's not about us. It's not about us. It's about the planet. It's about nature. It's about environment. It's not about us. Whereas climate change is completely about us, right? But I think there's this kind of cultural ways of talking about it and thinking about it that are really unhelpful, that are really tied up with righteousness, that are getting in the way of, getting the kind of public support we need, being able to talk about what's actually causing it and who is actually causing. Who, right? You don't see those questions a lot, like who's actually responsible for climate change and who's suffering the worst and who's going to benefit from the solution. So these are the kinds of questions I think are tied up with the greener than thou culture, which is why I take the whole Prius thing.
I want you to be the tiebreaker here.
Actually, the problem with the righteousness is that it allows the other side to privilege you, and that's really what the problem is. You turn yourself into a trope. You turn yourself into a fox, do something the same way. And part of the reason that we haven't made progress on this is because there are well-funded entrenched interests who don't want us to, who can use all the criticism and all this stuff to just trivialize the power. And it's been done very successfully in most of this country, at least.
I do think that that's part of the problem, but I think it goes deeper. I'm sorry, I'm going to go Jenny on this one. I don't know if I would say it's, I don't know if I would say it's the most serious problem, but I think it's a very serious problem in that, I mean, the righteousness and the idea of is tied up tightly with the idea of nature as this perfect Eden that we shouldn't mess with, and it prevents us from tinkering and from finding real solutions. And so, when you're talking to the guy in Houston who works at the oil company, instead of saying, we're on the same side of this. I don't want to put you out of a job. I want to figure out how you can thrive and how your kids can thrive in a sustainable economy. And we need you to make this economy that we have right now work. But we also need you to make this economy work for your children and to evolve. So I think that's a problem that I think liberal audiences, don't want to hear. They don't want to talk so much about how do we get the oil and gas companies, what are the good things that they're doing? What are the good things that conventional industrial agriculture is doing right now? How do we tinker with the planet to adapt and to make alternative energy sources? These are all really serious questions that I think come from the problem is more within my tribe than within the conservatives.
Steve.
I was wondering if cars were funny before car talk. Because car talk, to me, they're what? Aren't they PhDs? And yet they have this sensibility that connects with everybody. And I don't really care. I mean, I've worked on cars. I like cars, but I listen. I just feel good listening to that program, and they're conveying a tremendous amount of information. And that's sort of what Jon Stewart does. He conveys a tremendous amount of information, but finds a joy in conveying it. And I'm wondering if you see that happening with things like climate change, or if there's any model in there that can be used, because Jon Stewart obviously doesn't want to talk about climate change.
Yeah, it's interesting. Stewart and Colbert very rarely take on environmental topics. They do sometimes if you Google them, but weeks go by. Yeah, I mean, my students actually have found a lot of really wonderful examples of not so much biting critique about climate change, but gentler forms of humor, about climate change. And they are now creating projects that I think will also do that as well. But
I mean, the nice thing about those guys is you want to hang out with them. They're fully formed people rather than just a talking head that's talking about this one specific thing. People who don't care about cars want to listen to them because they're human, and I think that's the lesson. To just be human.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I guess I'd also tie it in with, to come back to the personal responsibility discussion a little bit, where I think you think about why do people listen to car talks? So they're funny, but I think it's also because you might learn something that could be valuable with your own car, right? Or have some sort of connection in that way because you've thought about problems with your car. And so if you were to do a show like that about environmental issues, then first you'd have to make it funny, but then it presumably would also connect to how people live their lives, right? Like make jokes about switching out light bulbs or whatever. And then Jenny would get all over you.
Excellent. So who wants the last question? Do we have someone in the audience who wants the last question? Yes.
I should go on the last one, but I'm reminded that the approach you're talking about sounds a bit like a marketing campaign. And like all marketing campaigns for industry, they measure whether they work or not, whether it's selling Priuses or even Jon Stewart and his audience ratings. Has anybody looked at, or is it even possible to see whether this approach works? Can you alter beliefs or behavior with this sort of approach?
I'm not interested in altering individual beliefs and behavior because I don't think that's the way to make change, so I'll pass it on to maybe folks who are more.
I disagree with you about that. I think you have to alter individual beliefs in order to make community change. And we do that at GRIST. We have someone whose job it is to track this as closely as possible, and he's constantly, tracking different hits and devising new ways to look at this. And I wish I could channel him for a moment, but we look at what actually draws people in, which tend to be, someone who hasn't ever heard of us before sees something that's funny and light that gets shared on Facebook. Those are the things that bring new people in. And then we're trying to figure out what brings those people to actually read something that's more substantive. And then that's connected to, that's sort of a missing link that we don't know yet, but we do know that when people take surveys and they're asked, have you changed, again, GRIST is a little bit more about personal responsibility. So GRIST asks, have you changed your behavior because of something you've read here? It's like 70% of people say yes. Of course, it's self-selected and they want to say yes. So
I'll give a big picture answer and a very small picture answer. The big picture answer is that I don't think anybody's figured out, so I work specifically on climate change and carbon pricing kind of issues like carbon taxes. I don't think anybody's figured out how to market that, right? That's why it's hard, incredibly difficult. So I think it would be valuable to figure out how to do that, but I don't think anyone's cracked that nut. At the very small scale level, I can say that I personally have made a half-decent successful career out of doing economics comedy with a little bit of an environmental twist to it. And so the fact that I'm able to do that, I feel like is at least some evidence that it works, right? And that I get invited to talk to business groups and things like that. So I have low expectations in terms of what I expect that group to come away from. I don't expect to go to the Florida Bankers Association and have them say like, yeah, carbon taxes. Like I want to plant a seed that maybe they'll think about down the road. And I think in that context, I think it works.
That's a nice positive note to end on. I just want to thank Nate and Yoram. We all maybe thank Nate. And just to say, I'm super pleased that there was significant disagreement because I think ultimately what this panel is about is that funny is serious business. That environmentalism is ultimately really serious business, which makes funny about environment really serious business. And so it's inevitable that I think if we have really different views, that we would bring different kinds of funny to the panel and different reasons. And so I think that's really ultimately what I'm really pleased, actually. So thank you also for your good questions, and go be serious.